Before we get started, I just want to say a few things about this wildfire situation in California. I was watching the chief of police today saying, if we catch you looting these houses, the ones that didn't burn, while people have evacuated, we will find you and we will prosecute you. Bullshit. What do we do to looters? What was it we used to do to looters that was very effective? Do you remember? Because I believe it should either be that or leave them to the flames. This is a catastrophic situation. We don't be kind to amoral, worthless looters in this situation. Also, the people in Southern California, sadly, are running out of water. They already drain rivers from neighboring states for their water every year. I have suggested, this suggestion is years old, how to solve California's water problem. I'll leave a link to a podcast I created maybe a couple years ago that says, to get the water, first kill all the lawyers. That's a figure of speech. I don't endorse injuring lawyers in any way. But it's lawyers who stand in the way of this answer. You can fix California's water problem, and it doesn't include draining the rivers of neighboring states any further. In the early part of the previous century, they came up with a solution to fix Southern California's water problem. At the time, it was a smaller city by a long shot. And the neighboring states, listening to California's problem, said, yes, this is a good idea. We should provide water on a humanitarian basis for the people living there now. This did not include telling California, sure, go ahead. Build an uncontrollable, completely maniacal megalopolis and take all our water based on that agreement. That wasn't what the people who signed this agreement had in mind in the early part of the previous century. You have a city built in a place where you have wildfires every year. There has not been a year since I have been aware of the television where California did not suffer wildfires, even on rainy years. California and the cities that they've built up with no consideration for planning are on major faults where earthquakes happen all the time. Wildfires, earthquakes, any other natural disaster you can think of, California is a target for these things. And yet we've encouraged the blind, unplanned, ill-considered expansion of towns throughout this region. Piss poor planning on your part does not represent an emergency on my part. I feel badly for the people suffering right now, today. But the people that came before them continued to vote in politicians that built a less and less and less sustainable California, especially Southern California. What happens beyond today is based on how stupid those people are today. For those who survive this, I wish you the best in Nevada or Montana or Texas or Illinois, but not in Southern California. That is an unsustainable, unsupportable cancer on the southwest armpit of the United States.
This is the Free Zone Communiqué, transmitting from Virginia's unoccupied sector. If you think smart cities, DEI, censorship, government intrusion, bug paste, and other left-wing nonsense are no longer a possibility, think again. We've won one election with slim majorities. Our work to rebuild a free and sane America has just begun.
My dad was a Vietnam vet.
Yeah.
When I think I was 4 when my dad left for Cameron Bay, and I was just distraught. My dad was my best buddy. I was just distraught, and everybody was like, "But he's going to be okay. He'll be back," all that. And they didn't realize because I didn't have the language for it. I had seen them unloading all the caskets before they loaded the troops on.
Oh, goddamn. And you were 4 or 5 years old?
I was 4. I
Wow.
remember it like it was yesterday. So I
Wow.
was 4 years old, and I very much remember that.
That'll
And
put a
matter of
snap
fact,
on a
I
kid's
was
face.
so inconsolable, they had to call our GP to come to the house and give me a sedative.
Jesus. So he did come back.
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
multiple times. He went and came back, went and came back.
Oh, he had 2 tours to Vietnam?
He had more than 2.
Where
He
Air
was
Force?
huh?
Where was he? Air Force?
Yeah.
Wow.
He flew on B-52s as a tail gunner.
Oh, okay.
He was on, there was a Canadian plane, and it was called a Caribou. And the Caribou had problems in that the sand would carbonize and turn to glass on the spark plugs, and the planes would fall out of the sky. So that was a problem.
Yeah, really.
And then he hurt his back at some point, and he had something to do with the A-10s. And then Daddy was kind of like radar. He could procure things. So Daddy was really good. His hooch had the best hooch in it. So everybody, like, he figured out how to get a full refrigerator there, and he
Say,
was getting
no
steaks.
fun
And
being in the military if you're not a pirate. You got to be a pirate.
oh, he was a pirate of the best kind. So it got to where the commander was like, "Hey, I hear you have a real refrigerator." He's like, "Yeah, you want a cold one?" He pulls
Yep.
out beer. Daddy was always well taken care of because he took care of everybody else.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I might even leave this in here by way of intro.
Well, it's
Everybody,
history.
this is Shannon Evans, and we're just sitting here chit-chatting. I know a lot of folks come to the show and say, when's this cranky old bastard going to talk about something besides politics? And here we are. Shannon is the 4th author, I think, we featured, 2nd historian in that genre. She's the host of the Tom Bigby podcast.
Yes, Tom Bigby Tales.
Yes, and there will be a link both displayed on the screen and below the media line, so you can go there. She's been on a host of other podcasts. I need to talk to those podcasts and find out how come they get guests so easy. When for me, it's like pulling teeth. Although we've had some really great guests, I can't complain. And we're going to spend a few minutes talking about small towns in Mississippi and history and whatever else pops into our heads while we're talking. But my first question is, Shannon, why Tom Bigby?
Well, the river that runs through this town is called the Tombigbee River, and it's pretty significant. At one point, our town was considered part of Alabama. They thought the Tombigbee River was the dividing line for the state. Well, that meant they were ceding a whole lot of land over to the state of Alabama that didn't belong to them.
Right.
And the Tombigbee River is a really historic river in Mississippi and in the United States. Hernando de Soto was exploring it. We know that because they found Spanish helmets and bits of breastplates and stuff that have been left here in this area. And it was very significant to the Choctaw Native Americans who lived here in this area and farmed this area. So this area is very fertile. It's called the Black Belt Prairie. And it's one of the wealthiest uh, areas of the U.S., both before the Civil War and then postmodern era, as far as for farming.
Farming is what makes it wealthy.
Yeah, the land is black and fertile. It's actually more fertile than the Delta, and it had already been cleared because they settled here earlier. The Delta really didn't get. I mean, it was very wealthy, but not nearly as wealthy as the area here was. We were
And
also had a we also had a direct route with the Tombigbee River all the way down to Mobile, and then that got our cotton out to the market.
Mhm. That was a vital area for Grant in the Civil War. He fought back and forth across the top of Mississippi at least 3 times. That must have been so frustrating.
Well, he was up in the more toward the northwest, and then of course he came down and he went to Vicksburg, and because the campaigns all up and down Shiloh, Nashville, Battle of Franklin, Tennessee, all of those.
Mhm.
Um, but there was a general here named General Stephen D. Lee, and he married a local girl. He was actually from Charleston, and Stephen D. Lee, I think he ended up being a 2 or 3 star by the end of the war. And he married a local woman who was from the Blewett family. And the Blewett family had been massive farmers out in the prairie, huge plantation, one of the larger ones. And they were connected to the Sykes and some others. And Nathan Bedford Forrest was very close with the Sykes family. And all these families, we laugh. We don't have a family tree in Mississippi. We have family wreaths.
Hmm.
But they all intermarried. So Stephen D. Lee is important to history for several reasons. One of which was he was the one who ordered the first shot fired at Sumter in Charleston.
Mhm.
And the other thing was that he worked, Blewett came to him and said, if we are going to be an independent nation, we have to have a source of a place to grow grain. You cannot have a nation without wheat. You have to have flour to run a country.
Mhm.
And the prairie here is the alternating crop at that time was winter wheat. And he knew that there was enough land on the Black Belt Prairie, which goes from South Alabama and then it comes up on each side of the Tombigbee River, and the Tombigbee River goes further inland into Mississippi, and it goes all the way up to an area that's called the used to be called the Divide Cut, which goes up to the Tennessee River. So it was just a very fertile river basin, and he knew that they could grow enough tonnage of wheat, but they couldn't lose it, and they couldn't let it burn, and they couldn't let it get salted and destroyed by Grant's army. So that was going to be their big stand. So while the fall of Vicksburg was awful and terrible, and it was a significant impact on the outcome of the Civil War, uh, the fact that they understood the vital capacity of the Black Belt Prairie uh, was a big piece of preservation. So uh, Nathan Bedford Forrest pushed the army of um, of the Northern Atlantic, and they went in the Ohio, and they went south, and so they burned up Meridian instead of Columbus.
Right. Right.
So so they went after the railroad instead of the farm fields. They kind of went, oh well, these are just farm fields. We'll just go on. And the,
You too can be a pooper. In 2018, I was an author with a WordPress site. My mission was to create better politicians by informing and inspiring the best of our voters. I succeeded one voter at a time. but there are more than 200 million of you out there. So I started the P4B, then the Jordan Corey Show, and ultimately the Free Zone Communiqué to widen my reach. Now we hope to rekindle your sacred, your important archival knowledge, and channel it toward building a healthier, more productive republic. You can add your voice in the comment section. Our words will echo, but how loudly and for how long depends on you. The more you support us, the louder the echo. The more you share, the more ears the echo will reach. We're working to improve our delivery and expand our reach. Subscriptions are still 100% free. Help us grow numerically and technically and remain a free site. You can donate directly or support our affiliate sponsors. There are buttons below the media line of this episode. Click on those for, I don't know, Trump gear, Free Zone gear, P4B gear, or just shop Poe River. I've reduced all the clothing, the t-shirts, the jackets, the hats to my cost plus shipping charged by Etsy. I feature some of the items, including the 65 hoodie below the media line. That's the one you see right here. The 65 hoodie is cool. You will be wearing the solution to regaining our republic right on your back. So share every post and episode. Subscribe or follow on Substack and Rumble. Become a political party pooper. You get it? Political party pooper. Pretty good. It's great, right?
And the knock-on effect of that was after the Civil War, Stephen D. Lee founded pretty much the Agriculture College, which is now called Mississippi State University. And some of the most cutting edge ideas of farming, like farm rotation and soil amendment and things like that, were brought about under his leadership. So even though he's a controversial figure because of his, secessionist beliefs and his segregationist beliefs and all of that, he did have his vision for creating that college has served this state and many other states as an example.
Well, that's important to emphasize. There are a lot of historical figures that some people tout them as being nothing but virtuous, and other people tout other historical figures as nothing but evil, and that's rarely the case. Most people are multifaceted. They have different life experiences, which is not to say if somebody had a personal fault, it doesn't minimize that fault.
And he was also, they're a product of their time. You have to take that into account.
And you have to recognize the things they did that do work. I had a great-great-grandfather who won the Congressional Medal of Honor and returned to Philly to be a part of engineering the first Penrose Avenue Bridge. The new one is now named for him.
Oh, wow.
But he was a bastard. This guy was, socially evil incarnate. He was a mean guy. He was a drinker. He was a racist. But he was still the guy who fought incredibly bravely in battle, accomplished a tremendous amount after the war. He helped organize a lot of the reunions for soldiers. He worked hard for soldiers' causes. I guess what you would call the VA today, doing post-Civil War.
Sounds like Stephen D. Lee. That's what he did.
Sounds a lot like it.
He's the one who created the Vicksburg. He was one of the ones who fought hardest to have the Vicksburg a national park designation, 3 national park designations, but he fought for a a way to memorialize the men who died there.
Right, right. A
That was
preserve.
a brutal siege.
Yeah. And at the time there was a lot of that. People recognized um, what was important post-war.
Hmm.
War's over, you stop fighting the war. There are people to this day who, in their minds, are still fighting the war.
Hmm.
We just tore down a Civil War monument up here in Arlington. I'm sure you heard.
Hmm.
Um, Worst piece of mindless vandalism I've ever seen, and a desecration of graves.
I have very mixed feelings on it. I'm very fortunate. The town that I live in, we had a United Daughters of the Confederacy statue that had gone up in like I think 1912, and it sat at the courthouse. Not an appropriate place for it when the predominant people in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s coming through that for some horrific sentencing were from the African American population.
Hmm.
So it was kind of but it ended up there purely by an accident. It was the ladies did this monument, but had it made, they raised all this money, but they never found a place to put it. So this was like they thought, oh well, we'll put it on Main Street. And they said, no, you can't put it on Main Street, it's too big. So they said, okay, well, we'll put it where Main and Market meet. And they're like, no, you're not going to put that. We're not going to do that. This is not Trafalgar Square. So it was going to go in front of City Hall. And they were like, there's not enough land. So it ends up, the courthouse is the only place that had enough land. And that's where it ended up. Well, about 3 years ago, there was a movement that it needed to be removed. And I agreed, it needed to be removed, but it needed to be preserved because it's still a piece of history.
Right.
So we have 2 Civil War burial vaults of men who came here from Shiloh, and that Columbus was a hospital town. And so they took the thing apart. The local Marble Works, which is a massive monument company here, and they do monuments all over the country, and they had it professionally cleaned, restored. They took it apart. I mean, I have all kinds of photos of the process. It was just fabulous. The whole town turned out to watch. There's not a lot to do here. So they took it away, and there were the people who were like waving Confederate flags and going, "It's go destroy it," and all this. And they're like, "No, we're going to take it. We're going to move it to this very famous cemetery." So now it sits where these men are buried.
Right.
And it's in a beautiful setting. And to me, it's like a prayerful monument. It is absolutely stunning. And behind it is a swamp called Lake Catherine. That's, Cypress Street. It is absolutely beautiful. And anyone can go out and look at it and read it and study it. And I think to destroy them is just awful.
Yeah. The key word you said was cemetery. The battlefields themselves and the cemeteries, the statues that were put there were paid for by private money often. The one in Arlington was private money. The government didn't.
Absolutely.
The ones that dot Vicksburg and Manassas and Gettysburg, towns would send them. If a general died there or did something heroic there, or any of their soldiers, the town would create a monument and put it in the battlefield or at a cemetery. And in this case, these were graves that were being messed with. And the justification was, like you said, the people who did things in the past were people of their times, and we are not. But the people complaining, this was a trend that started with the 2021 Defense Department Authorization Act, where they said you'll now change names of bases and stuff like this. And the people at the National Cemetery at Arlington decided, well, we're gonna be a part of this party. And people started talking about pulling this statue. And they're questioning what was in the mind of the artist when he was making this thing. If you've ever been there, it's like you said,
He
it's a
got paid
very
to do it.
reflective, it's a very reflective piece of work,
Yeah.
and it was an intricate piece of work. And people are
A
saying,
lot of
oh,
them were carved in Italy. A lot of the intricacies were carved in Italy and brought back over.
right, right. And people are saying he's obviously a racist, the guy who did this thing. And he's obviously pro-slavery who did this thing. And neither one of those statements were true. Every president from Lincoln to Wilson and beyond would hail these monuments because they were intended to heal,
Yeah.
intended to remind us of our history. You can't unremember your history, and we're going to get to that in just a second. But the reunification process was critical. And you do that by recognizing the sacrifices made on both sides. You can't ignore it.
No, and the other thing is, as they said, the old adage, if you don't remember your history, you're doomed to repeat it.
Correct.
This knee-jerk reaction of tearing down these monuments is stupid. Why not use it as a teachable moment to put a plaque or a signage up that teaches about how that was made, why it was there, the intention, and I just think, I don't know, it's just become it's like mob behavior in certain ways on both sides, the right and the left, and it's damaging history.
I'm sorry?
It's damaging history.
It is, and it's driven too much by the people I call the Karens in society.
Well, it's not just
those
women.
people are impossible to please. If you took down
There's a lot of Chads.
plaque, within 3 years they'd be screaming about the plaque.
Yeah.
The fact is, these things remind us every day. They remind us of what occurred from 1861 to 1865 and the horrendous sacrifice that was made, the horrendous loss that was endured.
Mm-hmm.
But let's follow through with that. You just made the point why history is important. If you could expound on it.
Well, history is important because, well, let me put this in two ways. Real history is important. A lot of history that you have been taught is not accurate.
That's correct.
A lot of it is propaganda. The winner gets to tell the story the way they want to tell it.
That's correct.
Sometimes victims like to tell it the way they're victimized, right?
Can I qualify that? The victors write the history books. That's true, in a sense that those who celebrate the victory will read the books and get their confirmation bias from the books.
What if I tell you that you're wrong? What if I tell you that in textbooks you're wrong? Do you want to know why?
No, yeah, I know. In textbooks.
Do you know the story of how our textbooks were written for history?
Does it go back to the founding of public schools? Because I know what.
No, it goes back to the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who took over along with General Taylor's, I believe it was General Taylor's son, Zachary Taylor's son, who was a rabid secessionist. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy decided that they would become essentially the voice of all future textbooks. And so they took over the repository. Essentially, what they did was they particular people in society and themselves, because many of them were teachers or people of women of means in society, and the largest textbook repository was in Texas. And so if they knew that if they could control how the textbooks taught history, that they could control the way that the South is presented in historic teachings. And so for even now, many of the textbooks that are out there are the content is still the content that was developed by the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the United Sons of the Confederacy.
That
And
doesn't surprise me. I mean,
oh,
textbooks different.
it is a very well researched and very not very well taught, um, that the perception is of this happened or that happened. So,
Sure.
for instance, when you look at the papers of secession for each state, so in the South, people will say, no, we seceded because of the lack of states' rights. But when you look at the actual enumerations, so there's the letter of secession, and then there's the enumerations, and the enumerations was a document of complaints, essentially. So
Right.
each state had a committee, and and all of them but two. The very first line was for they were the white in the community. The white community was so outnumbered by the black community in certain states, especially in Mississippi. They were terrified that the enslavement of these people would end. And so, and they would be outnumbered,
Right.
which was part of what happened during Reconstruction. There was, the codifications of the black codes and then Jim Crow laws and things like that.
Right.
But it was the very first line of all but Missouri and Alabama is for the perpetuation of their ability to enslave people.
Right.
There's not one word about states' rights.
The craziest part of that is,
Wait a minute, there's not one word about states' rights. That's what's so funny.
No, what I was about to say, the craziest part of that statement, that first line being there, and you can check the record, you can read up on it. Going back to Jefferson, there were people saying this is stupid. Slavery doesn't save money, it costs money.
Very expensive proposition.
Jefferson and Mason used to write back and forth to each other about it. Mason said, this aren't his words, but essentially his message was, this is our rocket sled to hell. We're not getting away with this, And there were people, slave owners, plantation owners, politicians from Jefferson's, from the Revolutionary War to the Civil War, saying we have to contract this out. We have to sharecrop. We have to, it's dead weight on the economy. And yet they couldn't bring themselves.
Well, and Jefferson struggled with it so much. And I think it was John Quincy Adams who told him that if he left the line in that made all men equal, including the enslaved, that there would never be a union, that there would already be a split before it ever started. And so essentially that was the first compromise.
That was a three-fifths compromise. That's correct. And people say the entire Constitution is a compromise because of that, and it's not. The entire Constitution is the entire Constitution. The question of maintaining union was the compromise.
Yeah, but that was the compromise.
And we paid 600,000 lives for that. 80 some years later.
Yep. And in many ways, we're still fighting it.
Yeah, there is that mentality, and quite honestly, I find it tiring. I find people.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I live in the Deep South where we see the economic disparity. If you go into old communities where there's never been any industry of any kind.
I lived in Mississippi for 5 years. I know exactly what you're saying.
Where were you?
Most of my time down on the coast, but my work would take me up into the farm communities.
Yeah, it's grinding poverty in a place that once used to be literally one of the wealthiest communities in the world, not just the nation, the world.
It's also a demographics problem. The population of Mississippi would fit in Columbus, Ohio,
Hmm.
the entire state. Um, so there's definitely planning issues that the politicians need to pay more attention to, and demographics and uh, more entrepreneurism. I think I don't know if it's changing now, but the big complaint I heard when I was down there, I was involved with political groups and a book club and all kinds of other stuff, and they said the kids were turning out functional illiterates out of high school. You know, um, that's a problem when you're trying to build an economy.
Well, part of it too is the state hasn't put an emphasis on education. Unfortunately, they just
Right.
don't. Our emphasis is on football, and this will probably annoy somebody, but I don't care. It's, flying, fishing, and football,
Yeah,
and somewhere going to church on Sunday. So, that it's like none of that's education.
yeah. I mean, our emphasis in major universities now are football.
Yeah.
These are football clubs with a little teaching gig on the side.
Hmm.
I'm
But they'll tell you it brings in a lot of money, but it doesn't bring in money for you're not they're not taking that money and put it into research
no
and and educating the students. So they're just using it to build bigger football fields
bigger football. Yeah,
and
yeah,
bigger training facilities and nicer dormitories for the football players. So I mean, I get it. I don't know what the answer is, but I do know this. And I do write a lot about graft and people who are greedy and people who do stupid things in my community. Uh, what I see is, everything we're doing now is creating history. So everything matters. And
right.
so it's like keeping a record of it. And so I'll tell you that irritates people because I read the record. If you buy a house, it's a matter of public record.
Yep,
If if you um if you run for office, it's a matter of public record. If you get arrested for a DUI on Sunday because you went to a football game and drove home after too many drinks, that's a matter of public record. So's
right.
your death. So everything I'm researching for history about, let's say, men who served in the Civil War, the women who lived in this town and did fabulous things. By the way, the women in this town seem to have invented a whole lot more than the men because they were too busy fighting war, I guess.
Right.
Um, and everything you do today is creating history. And so it becomes important to document all this. And so to tear down these statues, or the now the generation says, if I tell you something if I repeat in public something that was in the newspaper that's a matter of public record, they now call that bullying, which I kind of laugh at because I'm like, facts aren't bullying.
Yeah.
I'm reading from the newspaper. That's not bullying.
It,
Don't do bad things and get in the newspaper for bad things if you don't want to be talked about.
we are becoming a nation of 12-year-olds. That's my
Well, we are,
favorite hashtag, nation of 12-year-olds.
but the point is that this is all history, and so that's why it's important to me to capture it and to tell the stories and tell it in a narrative because it's more interesting.
This is the 65 hoodie. It holds the solution to rebuilding our republic. I plan to start a public speaking campaign about the hoodie and what it represents. So, if you know a GOP or libertarian group in the Mid Atlantic area that needs a speaker for a short civics lesson and a real political plan, I'm your guy. But you have to take the action steps. They're easy and effective. And grab your hoodie today. There will be a link below that says hoodie. Well, you have a very interesting way of doing that. I always say we need to pay attention to local politics, and I'm just as guilty as anybody of being seduced into the national political scene when that should be
Mhm.
the least important. We need to pay more attention to our local politics. but also our local history. And you've become quite brilliant at that. Describe your process. I love this.
Well, okay. So, one thing I do is I go every morning to the graveyard and I go for a walk. That's where I do my best thinking. Nobody bothers you. If I walk on a sidewalk, I can't think because somebody's going to say hello. It's the South. Everybody knows everybody, right? So I go to the graveyard. The dead don't bother you. They're dead.
They don't mind. Yeah.
They don't mind. And they actually, I think they welcome my company because, I pick up the sticks that fall down in a storm and whatnot. And I find somebody who's interesting to go and I go, oh, that's an interesting name, or it says he got two Purple Hearts or whatever. So then I go home and I spend about 15 minutes researching that person using public records. I look at military records. I look at uh, census records. I look in old newspapers. So I use online tools, and do. I go out every morning. The next day, I'll go back to that gravesite, and I'll film. I'll do a film of that gravesite and talk about that person for less than a minute. And then I go and I post that on YouTube, and there's a YouTube short. It's capturing that person's history. And I don't know if their ancestors will ever read it, or their descendants rather, but somebody in this town will see that there were carriage makers and there were railroad crossing guards and there were switch agents and there were, just salt of the earth people, as well as bankers and lawyers and doctors. And so all these people made up the fiber of this town over 200 years.
Yeah.
And our town
History
was
is not a
founded in
rote
1820.
exercise. Pardon me?
Pardon?
What about 1920? I'm sorry.
So our town was founded roughly about 1820.
Okay.
So we have a little over 200 years. So the other piece I do is I watch things locally. And I mean, I've been unfriended by the mayor on Facebook. I mean, really?
You.
Huh?
I said, good for you.
Yeah, well, it was really funny because he didn't like what was being said, and I think he thought it was me. But my cousin has a similar name, and she was the one he was arguing with, and it was really funny. He unfriended me because he didn't like me telling the truth. He had promised some money to someone in our community, to a nonprofit, without getting the city council's approval, and I found out about it through public records request. And that didn't go. He wasn't happy that I found that out.
No, I suppose not. The what I was going to say earlier was history is not a rote exercise. When we start reading history in grade school, it's just like your multiplication tables. For now, just memorize the tables. Just you'll figure it out later. It's the same thing with history. You know, Columbus
Yeah,
sailed
Columbus sailed the ocean blue in
92, and
1492.
right.
But we know there's so much more to that.
Yes, yes, and the idea uh, uh, is to inspire the children as they get older to dig deeper and learn more. The point of history is to gain a better understanding of who you are, of who we are, how we got here. Um, if
And
you
what's
want,
our responsibility to the future?
correct, correct, maintaining the information. Uh, what's the term I'm looking for? Curating information
Hmm.
that you may see, like you're talking about, looking at the gravestones. Um, there's a tremendous amount of information that's there. It's out there, but it's not been curated. And now you have a history of, for example, the Smith family, you know,
Hmm.
because the person in this grave, like you said, he won two Purple Hearts, we'll say, in Iwo Jima. His kids have done such and such since then. His family before that moved
Hmm.
to the area in 1850, and they had a farm. And that gives anybody, if they read that record, they may see a branch of that story that refers to something they're interested in. And now it's a whole new world. Now they're
Yeah,
talking about a whole new subject, you know? History isn't fluid, it's history. But to understand it, you have to spend time someplace other than um, a school history book, like we were talking.
correct. You have to look at the primary documents. That's my
Right.
thing.
No, the school history people didn't write Grant's memoirs, which,
No.
by the way, are rather fascinating.
Do you know where Grant's library is?
No, I don't.
Starkville, Mississippi, at Mississippi State University.
Really? I
Yeah.
do not know this.
So it was in Ohio. I think it was, it was either Indiana or Ohio. It was in the Midwest.
Yeah,
And the family wasn't happy with how his library was being maintained or not maintained.
right.
And so it's my understanding they went shopping for a new college. And Mississippi State said, "We'd love to have it."
Yeah.
And they thought, well, isn't that the craziest damn thing? And so they came. It's beautiful. It is absolutely wonderful to go to.
Isn't that
It,
ironic based on our earlier conversation?
yeah, I know. It's just the irony of it.
Right, right. And it's
So,
fantastic to hear. But I bought that book and read it over the summertime, late summertime.
mhm.
And I wanted it for the knowledge. I wanted to understand Grant, but I thought, boy, this is going to be a dry piece of reading. It wasn't.
No.
It was interesting, and he was interesting. He has way more depth than people give him credit for.
Well, the fact that the he was a cigar smoking alcoholic. That's not who he was at all.
That's correct. He was given to drink when he was bored. He wasn't very bored very often.
No, he wasn't.
Maybe outside Vicksburg, maybe outside Petersburg. Those were long slogs. But even outside Petersburg, he was directing distant battles constantly. He was
Hmm.
moving between 4 or 5 locations down there constantly and pouring over maps. It was Selby Foote in the Civil War series that said Grant would get so busy. He worked on his feet and he'd be bent over a map or bent over a letter writing, and he'd need something across the room, and he wouldn't stand up. He wouldn't stand up straight. He'd stay bent over, go across the room and come back and
Come back.
He was a very intense guy, but he was also remarkably relaxed, incredibly forgiving. You had to screw up pretty bad for Grant to fire you. At the time, all you had to do was pick your nose and Lincoln would fire you. But Grant got, I think, more loyalty and greater effort from his officers and his troops.
Well, he wasn't exactly the star student, so he came up scrapping.
Right.
So he knew the value of the roughshod soldier had far more value than the polished.
Yeah. Yeah. Polish did not impress him at all.
Well, no, that's why we had the first and the second Battle of Bull Run and went the way they went, because
Right.
the dandies, they were having picnics out there.
Yeah.
So
That would have been a sight to see. All those people in a blind panic trying to get back to DC when they thought this was going to be a show. So,
yeah. So
let me see. I have some notes here set aside. You seem to be fascinated with a Nancy Carpenter. Tell me about that.
Well, okay, so Nancy Carpenter was in charge of our Columbus Convention and Visitors Bureau. And I hadn't lived here for a while. I'd moved away. I'd been gone for 40 years. This is my hometown. So I came back in the midst of COVID. And I looked around and I thought, what the heck happened to all our tourism? This town used to flow with tourism. And we have gorgeous antebellum homes. Our town was one of the few that wasn't burned when Sherman had his march, and when, like I said, Grant came through here, and the Yankees came through. They went south of us, so our town was preserved. Well, for years, I mean, we would have busloads of people, just like Natchez does. And they were gone. And I'm like, well, what the heck happened? So the first year I'm here, I don't even think 300 tourists came through this town, and which is a travesty. So I'm at this, I'm at a parade, and I go up on the Tennessee Williams porch, which is the home that Tennessee Williams was born in, and it's our visitor center. And this woman, Nancy Carpenter, is up there talking to somebody, and they said something about this was a great opportunity for tourism. And she says, I don't do tourism. And I'm like, what? You're the director. This woman was paid $130,000 a year, which is a tidy sum in a town of this size,
Yeah.
to make
A whale
sure
of a
that,
song. In Mississippi?
yeah, in Mississippi, that's a tidy
work.
sum.
Yeah.
So like, why were we not having visitors? Well, that made sense. So then I started digging around, and I found out our convention and visitors center, a convention center, which is not small, but I mean, it's definitely not, like in Ohio. We're not in Columbus, Ohio, or Cincy or someplace like that. But we used to have quite a few events here. We had a Greek festival because we had a large Greek population. We'd have all these events here, and we're not having them anymore. We're not having plays. We're not having theater. We're not having musical events. We're not having anything. So I start digging, and I start looking in the newspaper, and this woman is going through tax money like crazy. So then I find out she's got a booth, she's got a box office, she's got a box seat at the football games over at Mississippi State
Uh-huh.
that cost $80,000 a year or more. And the reason why she has it was because she bought Jumbotron ads at the games that said visit Columbus, which is that's not our target audience. She was
Right.
spending
Right.
she's spending the money to get something in return for herself. And the
Right.
more I dug, the more I found out. So I just kept telling the story. I'm like, this is what I found this week, and this is what I found this week. And so I was doing FOIA request after FOIA request, and I found out she was using the company credit card. And I said, why aren't y'all figuring out that she's using a company credit card for personal expenses? They said, well, we don't ever see the bill. It's an auto draft out of the bank account.
Oh,
So I pulled,
who's the city manager?
no, this isn't the city. This is an organization. It's
Oh, okay.
created by the state. So, anyways, she got mad at one point because she wasn't getting what she wanted, and she tried to give the Tennessee Williams building is technically owned by uh, MDOT, Mississippi Department of Transportation.
Yeah.
So, if something happens, and the organization at that time was the Convention Bureau, now it's a private foundation, doesn't it has to be operated continually as a visitor center. If it's not, it has to be returned to MDOT. Well, apparently, without the knowledge of her board or the city fathers, she called and tried to give the building back to MDOT. I found out about that. So I just started making it public, and that she's not very happy with me. So they fired her.
Good.
So
They should
that
hire
result,
you. You should be at that place telling stories.
well, she's now the director of the private foundation that runs the Tennessee Williams building, but no one knows how she's getting her funding.
Wow.
And she also has
Is she
I mean, there's
related to Hillary Clinton? Come on, be honest.
no, I'll tell you where she's getting her money. She's robbing Peter to pay Paul. So she got a grant to do restoration work. So she needs to pay the bills. I'm betting there's some people getting paid, and she's using it to stay operational. She got mad because she's supposed to get her funding through the group she used to be the director of. So she put in a thing saying she wanted 100 and I don't know, she wanted like 145,000. I can't remember the number. Um, for the operation of that building. And they said, well, we will pay you to keep the building open, to keep the electricity, to pay the insurance, but we're not paying salaries.
Yeah.
And so so they countered, they said, well, we will, because it's a grant, we will grant you $88,000, but you have to give us the bills along the way, like we do any other grant. And she didn't like that. So she said, she walked away and she said, no, thank you. We won't take anything. And they're like, okay. And
Jeez.
so they put the money back in their general operating funds, and she still has no, so we don't know where she's getting her funding, except because this is where we go back to conflict of interest as transparency. She's she is she sits on the Mississippi State Archives um, Board of Trustees, and the Mississippi Department of Archives and History gave her a 300, I think it's like $288,000 in grants to do restoration work on the building. Maybe she recuses herself. I don't know. But she also, so she sits in multiple, she's always got her fingers somewhere where she can try and control the money.
I wish I had that talent. I don't know if I'd use it for good or for ill, but
Well, she
you
uses
know,
it for self. I mean, the stuff she's put in her, she's bought. There's pottery that was supposed to be owned by the Columbus, the CVB, and it never made it to the building. So, and I've seen it. Oh, that was the other thing. When kind of lazy. So when it came time to do ads for, like, let's say, come, tour our town or whatever, they in the Mississippi magazines, um, which she should have been advertising in other states as well, but
hmm,
whatever. She's so lazy, she would go get a picture of her house. And she used her house in all the ads. The problem with that is sometimes she was using the interior of her house. And guess what I found in on some of those interior pictures?
pottery. You see,
I
this is
can't
what
make this
I'm
up.
talking about. Awareness of what's going on in your own town. There, if you weren't there, nobody would know this.
But
When
that's not
state
true.
money,
They
when you're
do
gone,
know it, but they're afraid to say anything because they don't want anybody getting mad at them. And the
huh,
difference is I don't care.
that's
Why would you get mad about the truth? If you want to get mad, that's your choice, but that doesn't make the truth any less valid. And so, I have people go, well, aren't you worried you'll never work here again? And I'm like, well, I got plenty of work. I'll always have a job. I can always take care of myself.
right, right.
It's the pressures of the small town. We're like, well, when I, I went to church and nobody sat near me, I think it's hilarious. But everybody's afraid to, I mean, I went to a 12th night party and they said, we'd like to have you at our party, but we don't want you writing about our party in your podcast. And I'm
Yeah,
like, are you stealing money? No. Are you being mean to anybody are you taking advantage of anybody? No. Well, then why are you worried?
right. They're worried that somebody might be and they don't know about it.
Well, the lady in question, Nancy Carpenter, was at that party, and I was very polite. I said hello to her in every room she was in.
Wow. That's a great story. And uh like I said, people I'll say it again. If not for you, we wouldn't know because the people who did know weren't saying anything. And I would hazard a guess that a lot of the people who knew were probably responsible for saying something and didn't say something. So kudos to you, first of all. Is this where your term accidental historian comes from, or
Yes. Well, actually, because so I went to school to be an engineer. Then I became a teacher. Then I got a master's anyways, I have a master's in fine arts and creative writing. But I'd still go to school if somebody pay for it. I mean, I fell into this job a couple of years ago, and I've loved it, every minute of it. And it kind of goes with, I like being outside. I like digging. I've always liked being in the courthouse.
hmm,
I've done that since I interned for an attorney when I was in high school. And so I've always liked that, and I've liked being in archives. So I guess it all just kind of goes together. I'm very nosy, I guess.
A historian has to be nosy by nature. Yeah, just like any journalist, any commentator, you have to be willing to stick your nose where it makes people uncomfortable sometimes, or
Well,
when
and
nobody
also
else
be
wants to go.
and also being willing to, so it goes beyond the discomfort. I'm working on an expose right now on the Dixie Mafia, and I don't know how much you know about the Dixie Mafia, but
Biloxi. Yeah.
When Phoenix City collapsed in Alabama, mo four safecrackers and a whole bunch of other people, everyday people from Phoenix City, migrated to this town, Columbus, Mississippi, and just over the border in Alabama into a couple of the little communities there. And they worked here or they worked logging and truck driving over there. And the four men who were here were some of the most notorious safecrackers in the South.
Mhm.
And
There's,
they lived here. I
I read
babysat for one of them for years.
I read a book a couple years ago, and I honestly forget the name of the book. It was about two DAs in Biloxi. One was the father, and then years later, his son took over the same job, an elected position. I guess it was city attorney, not DA.
Mhm.
And it talks about the Dixie Mafia, and they do talk about how it's all over the state, but their concentration was on the drugs and the gaming and the booze in Biloxi, which is still Biloxi's probably still a pretty dirty town, but it's tolerated sort of, you know.
Well, I think a lot of their, legal betting cut into a lot of the money making.
Sure.
The interesting thing is that here the Dixie Mafia was more into the gambling and the money laundering. The drugs didn't come in later until later. Most of them did the people that I knew of and what I know about them was they did not like the drug trafficking. That was a whole different group. That was a whole different gang. And there was even honor among thieves, so to speak. They had, and I'm sure it's because their families were here.
A lot of gangs didn't like the drugs because it was so destabilizing when you had a wink and a nod from the authorities. So long as you're getting too uppity, you'd be okay. And now you want to do cocaine or heroin? That
When their
was,
mouths start going
yeah.
and then
And
they get blackmailed.
right. And they knew that the cops and the judges were not going to be so cool, no matter how much you give them, if you bring heroin into their town,
Yeah,
they're going
that
to be
is true.
upset with you, you know.
That is that is
So,
true.
yeah. But somehow that line got crossed and stayed crossed after about, well, the late 60s. There was a sheriff down there he lived in, I think he lived in Ocean Springs, but he would cross the border in and out of Biloxi all the time. And he was into drugs, booze,
Yeah. Well, they got greedy. A lot
institution.
of the middlemen were greedy.
Yeah. Yeah, this guy I think he ended up getting killed. I think he ended up with a bullet in the back of his head because
Yikes.
he did get greedy and he started playing one side against the other
Hmm.
on both sides of the Biloxi Inlet. Um, but yeah, interesting stuff. I'm trying, well, we're going to wrap up on this one because we've been talking about important issues and down to earth stuff. But you have made a study of the paranormal. Would that be correct?
Well, when you live on these old houses and you have all this swampland, there's all kinds of tales. And then when we were kids, we used to go ghost hunting all the time. And there are a lot of, I believe they're ghosts. I believe they're entities who just haven't, that they've left an essence of themselves. Or maybe it's just that essence that lives there. And some of them are naughty. none of I've only encountered one that I thought was intimidating.
Uh,
Um, but there's a little bit of everything here. It's the South. If you don't have a ghost, you don't have a Gothic story.
that's right. What is a cryptid?
Okay, so the Native American, a cryptid is an unexplained creature of some sort. I mean, Sasquatch is kind of a cryptid, I guess. The Boggy Creek Monster, all of those things. There's there's a legend that goes back to a piece of land called Black Creek. And Black Creek runs through close to the Alabama line. And that was where Andrew Jackson's highway came across Black Creek, and some dragoons got lost and drowned. And then the horses, supposedly, the men didn't want to go in the woods and in the water. They saw something. So I found a piece of writing about this swampy area that a Native American had told a story to someone, and they had recorded this story. And the story is that there's this creature, other Native American groups, it's very similar to the description of what's called skinwalkers. But this entity is in this wooded area, in this swamp, and it has, it has weird teeth and a weird mouth, and it's white, and it's got big black holes for eyes, and you know, all these, anything that Hollywood could probably do even better than I could in describing.
You ever go back there?
Well, yeah, hang on. Yes, but what's very interesting, I don't drink. And I know somebody's going to tell me next. So what were you smoking or drinking? Well, I don't do that. And at the time there's a group of people who live down in this area still called Black Creek. And they don't go outside at night. They don't like they get their dogs business done and get them back in the house, put them in their pens, whatever.
Yeah.
And their stories are all very similar. And yet some of them have never spoken to each other, or they match the stories from this old story I found that's not in circulation. And I call it, I don't know, it's pale, I don't know what you want to call it, skinwalker, pale, whatever. Um, but the people who live back there are a very modest income,
Mhm.
and they're not believed. And so these are very blue collar workers, they're retired, they're veterans. And so their story's not listened to, which because of their socioeconomic status.
Right.
And so their story is discounted. And so the discount has nothing to do with the story or their experience. It has to do with their socioeconomic status. And so that became fascinating to me. And then I haven't had a chance to do more work in that area, but I've had more and more people come and tell me about it. And I work with someone else who we both have had this experience. And so we were both trying to find out why us, why that time, and why there, and why these people.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What did you find out regarding
Well, there's still more to find. There's something to it. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's just energy, if it's swamp gas, if it's, I don't know, some creature we've never identified. Because it's a thick woods, it's swamp.
Yeah.
Who knows what it is? But these people have a valid. They're validly afraid. And if it's group fear, I don't know, because they don't all know each other.
Right.
But their stories are almost the same, and they don't know each other.
It could travel to China and back before the neighbor finds out. It's crazy.
So who knows? Maybe it's an angel, and I just don't know why it's there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is a detour for the P4B, but it didn't have to be the first one. We had Susan Munson on. She's a historian. She specializes in Jefferson and George Wythe are her two most fascinating subjects. George Wythe, if you don't know him, get the book. It's, as a matter of fact, I'll put a link to that book in on the screen and below the media line. But she also dabbles in the paranormal, and she believes she can channel some of these people. But we never got there. We spoke for an hour and a half on George Wythe alone. He's such a great guy, such a great study that I had to cut it off. We never even got to the spooky part. But,
Well, I'm not a conjurer. I'm just an observer. And somewhere in folk tales and ghost tales and stories is truth, or there's history,
And you can't swing a cat anywhere in the world without coming across things that are simply unexplained and unexplainable. And
I'm open for it.
At our level of understanding.
Yeah, I'm open for it. I mean, who am I to say it isn't real?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, Shannon, this has been an awesome hour. Holy crap. I was hoping to get maybe a good 20 minutes in the can. That'd be good. I still have to do my stuff. But I'm going to do a pause here. A little gap so I can cut it out. Don't bail as soon as I sign off.
I was going to add, I have a couple of guests I might suggest to you.
Yeah, say again.
I have a couple of guests I would like to suggest to you.
Oh, that's awesome. We'll do that offline on the sidebar. Okay. But with that, with an hour in the can, I appreciate your time. It's been awesome. If anything fascinating comes up on the Tombigbee River, I want you to contact me and we'll talk about it. We'll bring you
like
back.
that.
It'll be great. And also, the link for the Tombigbee Tales podcast will be below the media line. You definitely want to read that. This sounds like the coolest legal gossip ever. So if you're
I don't know that it's gossip. It's exposing future history so that there's a record.
Perhaps we can arrange where you can mentor the P4B audience and any other audience, mentor them on how to ferret out facts and history, because there's a method to it. You can't just start knocking on neighbors' doors and asking stupid questions.
Well, you can, but
Yeah, but that'll get you
have a plate of cookies with you.
or a punch in the face. But Shannon, thank you very much for being with us, and we'll have you back real soon.
Thank you. I enjoyed this. It was a pleasure meeting you, Mr. Jordan.
So did I.
Please tell a friend about the Free Zone Communiqué. We live and die with the share and subscribe buttons. Please use affiliate and sponsor buttons to support our work. Thank you very much for joining us today.